It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our school and the Irish School of Ecumenics and Afri to this evening on No More Hiroshimas, a very important topic. Our school, over the last year, interestingly, has had a connection to the Hiroshima Peace Museum. If you turn around, you can see 3 pieces of calligraphy. Dreams, Hope and Peace are written on the wall over there by visitors from Hiroshima, which makes this, as well as our wider concerns as a school for peace studies, our wider concerns with understanding the causes of violence, the causes of war and the relationships that can lead to peace, makes this a very apt space for having this wonderful evening. On that basis, I would like to welcome you all very warmly and hand over to Katie and the panel.
Thank you so much, Gillian, and good evening, everyone. My name is Katie Martin. I'm the coordinator of Afri, and it's really an honour to welcome you here, both on behalf of Afri Action from Ireland, but also on behalf of Irish CND, and also with the kind support of the Irish School of Ecumenics, so Mille Mille Buikas. So to place this event in context, many of you may know that this year marks 80 years since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are moments that changed the course of human history and continue to call on all of us across generations to reflection and to responsibility. More than 200,000 precious lives were lost, and generations since have lived with the ongoing pain and legacy of those attacks. And the horror of Hiroshima is not only a lesson in history, it is a living call for peace, for disarmament, and for justice for all of us. And as we witness the ongoing militarisation of the world around us, from Gaza to Ukraine, from Sudan to Yemen, and even in Ireland and across Europe, the moral urgency of that call remains as clear as ever. So, in that vein, we are just so deeply honoured to welcome Kyoko Gibson here this evening, a second-generation Hibakusha who has travelled from Wales, also joined by her daughter Liz, to share her story. And over today and tomorrow, Kyoko will participate in 5 different events in Ireland, from schools and universities to meeting with public representatives, ensuring that the testimony of Hiroshima continues to resonate and inspire new generations to take action for a nuclear-free world. So just to tell you a little bit more about Kyoko, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last 24 hours. So Kyoko was born in 1948, just 3 years after the bombing of Hiroshima. And she grew up in a community marked by loss and illness, but also by resilience. And she now lives in Wales with her husband and her 3 children, one of which we're joined by tonight, Liz, and she also has 7 grandchildren as well. And a very important thing also is she serves as the Women's General Leader for Wales and the marches in Soka Gakkai International, which is a global Buddhist movement for peace, culture and education with more than 12 million members across 192 countries. And through her testimony and activism, Kyoko carries forward the memory of Hiroshima to ensure that such devastation is never repeated. And Kyoko, we are just so grateful for your courage and your generosity of spirit and your presence here tonight. And your story carries both the pain but also the hope of Hiroshima. And I know I've listened to it twice already, but what really resonates is that we must remember, and when we remember, we also must act. So I'm very delighted to hand over to you now, and if you could join me in giving Kyoko a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about abolition of nuclear weapons. This is my experience as someone who was born and raised in Hiroshima. I'm 2nd generation of Hibakusha. I shall begin by saying that because English is my 2nd language, and talking about my experience in Hiroshima is very difficult even now. So as not to become emotional, I will read directly from my prepared note. I hope you will understand my Welsh Japanese accent. The late SGI, President Joseph Toda, made a historical declaration about the abolition of nuclear weapons on the 8th of September 1957 in front of 50,000 young people. His aim was to establish the idea that the use of nuclear weapon was an act that would deny humanity its fundamental right to exist. He hoped that by allowing this idea to penetrate deeply into the heart and the mind of people throughout the world, particularly the leaders in each country. And by establishing this internal criterion, he would prevent the use of nuclear weapons. He meant crush the tendency in the people's mind to justify the use of nuclear weapons. Mr. Toda was thus convinced that it is the existence of Buddha nature within human beings that would guarantee the abolition of nuclear weapons without fail. Since a human being created the atomic bomb, it must also be human beings that make possible its abolition. Since then, Dr. Daisaku Ikeda was one of the foremost peacemakers in the world carrying on this movement. He was 95 years old when he passed in 2023 and worked tirelessly for the sake of humanity. Mr. Toda's true reason for this declaration was that nuclear weapons and their use must be absolutely condemned, not from the standpoint of ideology, nationalism, or ethnic identity, but instead from the universal dimension of humanity. Nobody has the right to take precious life. Everybody has the right to live life. My faith believes in the dignity of life, because life is the most precious of all things. On the 6th of August 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima with a population of 350,000. Hiroshima was apparently chosen because of the clear sky overhead that day. Good visibility made it easy to observe the destructive capacity of this new nuclear technology. Under that mushroom cloud, rising out of a temperature of 5,000 degrees, some say 7,000 degrees centigrade. As we know, water boils at 100 degrees and still melts at 1,500 degrees. 70,000 died instantly, and many more afterwards. So within 4 months, 140,000 died, and to this day, people continue to die from radiation-related illnesses. The actual dropping of the bomb took only 10 seconds, but the effects have continued and will continue for generations. I was brought up in a community filled with families suffering tremendously from the effect of the bomb. Although I was born 3 years after the bomb was dropped, no information was available as to the possible consequences. Because of that, people were ignorant of the effect of radiation. We grew and ate vegetables from contaminated soil and ate fish from the polluted sea. However, people like me and others who were indirectly affected by the bombing that day are not counted among the statistics. Even now, there is a lot of suffering behind the closed doors. Marriage is very difficult, as it may produce babies with physical challenges. People had lost hope and confidence for the future, because they felt that they didn't have the ability to provide for and care for their family and uncounted atomic bomb orphans. We cannot imagine what kind of life they lived and who were never mentioned. There was a high suicide rate among victims and their families. And we did not use a condition called PTSD at that time, but there were many people who had PTSD. They saw loved ones who were melting in front of their eyes. They witnessed the horror of many burned people crawling to the river and dying in the water. This was an absolutely random hell, man-made hell. I remember when I was small, even though nobody told me, but I knew not to stare or ask questions about the people whose skin had melted with the intense heat. My family was no exception. All were affected physically and mentally in one way or another. I was affected more than my siblings and had the most difficulty with my health. The only explanation was the after effect of radiation. Also, the mental and emotional stress that each one of us bore, because we didn't know what illness could be residing in our body and whether they could be passed on unknowingly to our children and grandchildren. One family I remember had their whole skin burned off by the heat. When you are skinless, your body is shiny and pink and in agony. It was horrendous to see. Some people managed to live on for years like this. Another neighbor had a huge burn scar on his back that he looked a bit like a tortoise with a shell. One day, the scar became very itchy and his family said it was moving. Suddenly, from underneath the scar came a huge amount of pus and live maggots. I can never forget those images. And even now, after so many years, it is very difficult to talk about it. Can you imagine if you had lived with and watched those you care for and love undergoing such excruciating suffering? I was the weakest child in the family. I was told by my doctor that I had only a 50% effective immune system. So far, I have had lymph nodes and the cancers removed many times. The last cancer operation was the 20th of January this year. 16 stitches all over my body now. But the doctors in Japan and in the UK are not able to say these are an effect of how I lived in radiation-filled environment. Even though I never heard my mother talk about the bombing, she would quote from the writing of Nichiren Daishonin saying, "Life is limited. We must not begrudge it. What we should ultimately aspire to is a Buddha land." She meant the land of humanity. I can feel from that my mother's determination for all of us to be happy. When I was a little older, I used to be involved in the peace movement. I carried a placard to demonstrate for peace. No more bombing, no more war, and no more Hiroshima. Each time before I left home to take part in a demonstration, my mother would gently shake her head and say, "You cannot change people's heart by carrying a placard." I would say, "I know, Mother, but I want to change the world and change it now." But she never stopped me from doing it. However, she did ensure that I continued to practice the philosophy of deeply respecting the dignity of life. One day I heard a head of state say that he was horrified to hear what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after giving a long speech with many condolences, then he said, "But I'm glad this didn't happen to us." This statement horrified me, and I realized that we have tendency to think, "Thank goodness that wasn't me." It was then that I realized the truth of what my mother had said. This was my turning point. In 2003, SGI President Daisaku Ikeda made a historical proposal to United Nations in which he talked about a life-sized paradigm for our age. He said, quote, "The way forward, I believe, lie in developing a life-sized paradigm by which to understand our world and where we stand in it." By life-sized here, I mean referring to a way of thinking that never deviates from the human scale. It is simultaneously a human sensitivity to life, a whole, and also to the detail of everyday human existence. I believe it is an approach that is urgently required in response to the challenge of our age, unquote. When scientists develop the atomic bomb, and when those in power decided to use this weapon on people, and the bomber pushed the button, did they think that their action would have such a devastating effect on all of those individuals who had names, faces, and felt the joy and sorrow of life? In September 2000, I returned to nurse my dying mother in the hospital in Hiroshima, which treats radiation victims. The doctor gave my mother 2 weeks to live, and my sister and I stayed with her around the clock. One day, I heard a voice from the radio coming from the next room to my mother. I soon realized that it wasn't the radio, but an elderly lady repeating over and over and again, "Mommy, it hurts. Mommy, it hurts." She was a little girl again, calling out to her mother. She was a survivor of the atomic bombing, who had lived so long and was ending her life in this way. When her sound stopped after 2 days, I wanted to scream on her behalf, which I did. Everybody knows that we should not destroy lives, but many don't know how to actually treasure life. I often used to feel overwhelming sorrow, but I know now how to transform hunger, anger, and foolishness, which all human beings have, into compassion, courage, and wisdom, and encourage others to do the same. In October 2000, I finally visited the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima, which I and my family have never been able to physically do. I entered the building by myself and renewed my vow to work for world peace on behalf of my late parents, elder siblings, and the people of Hiroshima and the world. I hope our voices are loud enough to ensure that this must never be repeated again. I am dedicating my life to create the cause for happiness rather than try to treat the effect. There are still 12,331 nuclear weapons in the world, and 3,904 are actually active warheads. We are sitting on those nuclear weapons every day. And still, in many people's mind, nuclear weapons are necessary evil. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought the threat of nuclear warfare to the forefront. But how would modern nuclear destination impact the world today? Provides stark information on the global impact of nuclear war. A group of scientists said, it doesn't matter who is bombing whom. It can be India or Pakistan or NATO and Russia. Once the smoke is released into the upper atmosphere, it spreads globally and affects everyone. What is the purpose for using nuclear weapons to kill human beings? Many believe it was finishing the Second World War with Japan. There are two other reasons in 1945. One, they would like to see how their work performed. And two, they would like to show what Americans can do to enemies. What a dreadful thought. I no longer carry a placard to demonstrate for peace, but I have a huge banner in my heart for world peace. Hiroshima is now the most beautiful and peaceful city because there are many thousands of people practicing philosophy of deeply respecting the dignity of life. My hope is no children go through what I went through in their life. Never, ever again. So I will keep going this humanistic work of abolition of nuclear weapon activity until the last breath of my life. Thank you giving me opportunity to talk about my experience, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
We're now going to turn to two Irish voices who bring scholarship and activism together in the pursuit of peace and disarmament. So first, Dr. Iain Atack, retired Assistant Professor in International Peace Studies here at Trinity College Dublin, and author of The Ethics of Peace and War and Nonviolence in Political Theory. Iain is going to speak to trends in global militarisation and the need for a broader conception of human security. His reflections explore how the war system, the deep political and economic structures that sustain militarisation, threatens both human and ecological survival, and how a reimaginative, cooperative understanding of security rooted in justice, equality and sustainability can replace the dominance of military power.
So just to begin by thanking Kyoko for her very profound and moving personal testimony about the impact of the use of nuclear weapons, not just immediately, which of course is horrific, but also in the years that follow and even in the generations that follow. And also for your work on behalf of nuclear disarmament and removing these weapons and the possibility of the use of these weapons. So again, Kyoko's testimony, I think, reminds us of the horrors resulting not just from the use of nuclear weapons, and as terrible and as overwhelming as these are, but also of the death and destruction resulting from all war and armed conflict, from the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza to the wars in Ukraine, Sudan, Yemen, and elsewhere. And just to say, it's good to be back in this room again, where I spent many years as a lecturer on the International Peace Studies Programme. And I have this opportunity to speak to you tonight about these important issues, and also to hear music again in this room, because I used to use music sometimes to illustrate particular points relevant to the topic of my lectures. So what I would like to do is build on Kyoko's testimony to discuss the need to oppose and resist war and militarism wherever and whenever it occurs, particularly from an Irish perspective, and to connect the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons abolition to this broader analysis of the causes of war and the possibilities for peace, which I think Gillian mentioned in her introductory remarks. So to put a broader frame on this discussion, to suggest that we need to challenge not only individual wars, but also the social, economic, and political factors that produce war and armed conflict. And this is because war is not only an event, it is also deeply embedded in economic and political structures at multiple levels, from the local to the national to the international. So, as Katie mentioned, this is why we need to understand war not just as a specific or separate event, but as a system or as an institution that we need to work to oppose, dismantle, and replace. So as part of this discussion or this analysis, I think we can begin by making this distinction between war making and war building as components of this bigger war system. War making involves episodes of armed conflict, specific episodes of armed conflict between or within states, or war as this specific military or historical event. War making requires, but also reinforces the war system because of the massive expenditure on weapon systems and armaments needed to engage in particular or specific wars and armed conflicts. War building, which is the other component of the war system I want to mention, involves financing and developing the military infrastructure required to prepare for war making or the actual engagement in armed conflict and war. So this involves manufacturing weapons and armaments, the global arms trade, the recruitment and conscription and training of soldiers, the establishment and maintenance of military bases, both domestically and internationally. So what is sometimes referred to as the military-industrial complex. So this is also a significant component of the war system. War building is the foundation of the war system because it involves creating and supporting the capacity for war making as a persistent and ongoing feature of politics, society, and the economy that we need to work to resist, oppose, replace, and find alternatives to. The war system, of course, is also deeply political and is above all else a system of power and control and domination. The massive amounts of military spending, the global arms trade that form the military-industrial complex support states in the pursuit of global and regional hegemony, facilitate the competition, economic and political, between countries or between societies as a crucial component of the war system. And to come back to the issue of nuclear weapons in particular, nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war remain perhaps the most dangerous component of the indiscriminate threat that the war system poses against not only human well-being and the lives of vast numbers of human beings, but against human survival as such. Yeah, nuclear weapons really are a core component of this broader understanding of the war system that we need to resist and oppose. So the 9 states that have nuclear weapons, which includes, of course, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, continue to build, modernize, and deploy nuclear weapons as part of the war building process, and use these nuclear arsenals to threaten and to wield power against other countries. So building or constructing systems or structures that can replace the war system involves challenging and replacing this narrow idea of militarized security that is a core component of the war system and is used to justify and maintain the war system, including the massive expenditure on armaments and nuclear weapons. So this more positive dimension, human and ecological security, aims at meeting fundamental human needs, preserving our natural environment, and replacing this exclusive, narrow focus on militarized concepts of security. The social, political, and economic conditions that promote human development, fundamental human rights, and protection of the environment are required to support human well-being and the well-being of the planet, and hence human and ecological security. So there is an obvious contradiction then between this narrow focus on military security as a core component of the war system and human security, human and ecological security more broadly understood, because of course prioritizing military security requires continuous and ever-increasing expenditure on weapons, consumes the resources that we need to build and achieve genuine human and ecological security, and results in war and armed conflict and their massive loss of human life and the destruction of the natural environment. So, yes, to build on this, the kind of environmental or ecological dimension of this broader concept of security, there is obviously a crucial link between military spending, the war system, and climate change as one of the existential threats that confronts us and obviously undermines this broader notion of human and ecological security. War and armed conflict themselves, of course, cause massive environmental damage, as we've seen in Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere. But the military and the war-building component of the war system are also huge contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, both through their reliance on fossil fuel consumption for operational purposes, but also through, of course, what's required to produce the weapons and armaments in the first place. So it's been said that if the world's armed forces were a country, they would rank 4th in terms of their responsibility for global greenhouse gas emissions, behind China, the US, and India. And that's without taking into account the environmental impact and destruction caused by war and armed conflict themselves. So again, to come back to the alternative is to work for this broader concept of human and ecological security as an alternative to the war system that removes the causes of all wars through cooperative rather than competitive approaches to shared human problems, so that the protection of human beings and the environment becomes the primary concern of international politics and global and domestic politics. This requires a reciprocal rather than a zero-sum or competitive approach to politics, and requires cooperative responses to shared problems such as poverty, inequality, and climate change. So this is a core element of how we can work towards achieving this broader human and ecological concept of security. The components of human and ecological security can include disarmament, obviously, conflict resolution and conflict prevention, dealing responsibly with climate change and biodiversity loss, human rights and gender equality, and education and healthcare. So these deal with the real threats that we need to deal with as human beings, as an alternative to this counterproductive emphasis on militarized approaches to security that only supports and builds the war system rather than opposing it and helping us to move beyond it.
Thank you, Iain. That was a fantastic conceptualisation of maybe a world beyond war, which I think we're all striving for. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. David Hutchinson-Edgar, who's the chair of Irish CND and has been long involved in the peace movement in Ireland. David has played a key role in Irish civil society's advocacy for the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, ensuring Ireland's voice continues to resonate globally in the call for abolition. His reflections tonight, titled Ireland's Disarmament Tradition and the Global Movement for Nuclear Abolition, will explore how small nations such as Ireland and engaged citizens can play meaningful roles in shaping a world free from nuclear weapons.
Looking back first to Ireland's initial advocacy for limitations on nuclear weapons in the 1950s, immediately after Ireland joined the United Nations. Ireland was widely expected to play a subsidiary part in the Western group in the United Nations as part of the Western European, as another Western European country. And it was something of a surprise when Ireland took an independent line on key matters within its first year as part of the United Nations body. And looking at the possible reasons for this, I think there's a number of things that are important. And I think memory plays a part in all of that. I think memory plays a big part in how we conceptualise talking about nuclear weapons today. We've heard Kyoto's testimony, and we're privileged to be here at a moment where her memory and her testimony intersect with our present experience that we carry forward into our futures. And I think for the early Irish delegations headed by Frank Aiken, the Minister for External Affairs appointed in 1956, memory played a key part in Ireland's independent line at the United Nations. At a very personal and local level, Aiken and others around him were deeply troubled by the memory of the futile brutality of the Irish Civil War a couple of decades beforehand. There was also the memory of Ireland's first ventures in an internationalist vision through the League of Nations in the 1930s. A vision and a project which ultimately foundered on the rocks of militarisation and nationalism. Yet there was still, in the emerging Irish tradition as an independent, neutral state, there was the seeds of an alternative vision of an internationalist world which worked together for peace rather than for a competing balance of military status among rival military blocs. And that was, I think, another part of that memory that the early Irish negotiators drew on. The third part, I think, was the immediate memory of the horror of the Second World War. The horror of thousands of Irish dead, even from a country which had been a non-combatant. The horror of the images of the brutality and destruction that came from the continent of Europe, the horror of the images of brutality and destruction that came in the last days of the war from Japan, with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think, informed by that tradition, the Irish delegations chose to take a moral stand. It wasn't a politically expedient stand, but it was a moral stand where memory met the material reality of a rapidly arming world, a rapidly rearming world. And this is a world which is rebuilding after the destruction of so many cities in the aftermath of the Second World War, rebuilding lives, rebuilding communities, rebuilding economies, along with delegations from other small nation states, largely countries like New Zealand, other countries from the emerging post-colonial world in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and new voices from Latin America like Mexico. Ireland took an alternative stance to the big power blocks model of rebuilding military security, rebuilding military rivalry, as Iain has already evoked, as one of the cores of the new world order after the Second World War. And Ireland offered an alternative vision of internationalism, along with other partners, and of a movement focused more on disarmament and of demilitarisation and of rebuilding the positives of community and economy rather than of military. And there's an excellent, very recently published article by Dr. Martin O'Driscoll from UCC, the UCC historian, on the work of Frank Aiken and the Irish delegations between 1956 and 58, with the delightful title of A Real Bell Ringer in International Politics, which is well worth finding online, published just last month in the journal Cold War History. And O'Driscoll speaks of how the Irish delegation drew on the Republican international principles of sovereignty, consent, equality and liberty, while nurturing the UN as the global representative of all states with the mandate to promote peace and justice. And I think that sums up very appropriately the vision that the Irish state and the Irish delegation to the UN in particular, which was headed by Aiken for several months each year at this time of year for the General Assembly, that they brought to that emerging new world of the 1950s. So from the late 1950s to right through the 1960s, each year the Irish delegation brought a series of resolutions to the UN General Assembly, which became known as the Irish Resolutions, seeking the support of the General Assembly for the negotiation of a treaty which would limit the spread of nuclear weapons and ultimately lead to nuclear disarmament. And after much negotiation, resisting much pressure from the countries which saw themselves as the powers of the day, some of which still see themselves as the powers of the day, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, and attempts to bring Ireland into line with many of the rest of the countries in the Western, what was perceived as the Western Bloc. Yet Aiken and his fellow diplomats resisted that pressure and made compromises around the edges of their vision to a sufficient extent that they received the support of the General Assembly, in tandem with the support that they already had in the work of other states for that. But Ireland was always perceived as a leader in this regard, which resulted in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which eventually entered into force in 1970, with three strands: the disarmament strand, the non-proliferation strand, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy strand. The peaceful use of nuclear energy strand allowed nations to develop nuclear energy separate from weapons programs. The non-proliferation strand, I think, was largely successful in that only one country has ever withdrawn in order to develop nuclear weapons. 3 countries subsequently developed nuclear weapons who had never signed up, but only one country has withdrawn in North Korea in order to develop nuclear weapons. And many other countries which had nuclear capacity, quite a few countries in Europe and in other parts of the world, including countries that would have seen themselves as powers, emerging powers in their continents, like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, which potentially had the capacity to seek nuclear weapons, resisted that urge and became leaders in turn of the movement away from nuclear weapons, of the nuclear disarmament movement. But unfortunately, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has never delivered disarmament and did not in itself contain the mechanisms for disarmament. It always envisaged further frameworks which would provide the procedures and verification processes for disarmament. But as the 1970s led into the 1980s, it became clear that it was not delivering in this regard, and that the nuclear arms race was continuing at a dangerous pace, which brings me to the second moment in the 1980s, when I think we have probably the most powerful upswell of popular resistance and popular movement from the ground up against nuclear weapons. And this was also the age of the beginnings of mass communication, where every household had a television set for the first time. Images of May Day parades in Moscow with nuclear warheads paraded through the streets were beamed across the world. Images of warfare throughout the world entered people's living rooms on a daily basis. The sense of threat was greater than it perhaps was ever before, with the calamitous and unthinkable quantity of nuclear warheads which were in existence and primed and ready to fire at that time. And I think that common awareness throughout the world was one of the factors in engendering a powerful resistance movement at that time, throughout the world, in many instances spearheaded by women. And perhaps one of the most powerful images of that women's leadership is the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And that movement was attended by representatives from Ireland who took part in the Greenham Common camp. And ultimately, the threat of American cruise missiles in Britain and in Europe, ultimately they were removed again from the UK, though very sadly they may have returned. There hasn't been official confirmation from either government, but they may have returned in the past summer to Lakenheath RAF base in Suffolk. But I think again, that generation was of the 1980s was, I think, also inspired by the childhood memories of the Second World War and the childhood memories of deprivation, and that sense that this must never be allowed to happen again. And in particular, it must never be allowed to happen on the far greater scale that nuclear armaments threatened. The scale not just of the destruction of millions of lives, the destruction of cities, the destruction of so much in the Second World War, but the destruction of the entire planet, with the potential for that to happen many times over in the huge volumes of nuclear weapons. And as Kyoko said, we still have roughly 13,000 nuclear weapons today. Less than half of the Cold War peak, but still enough to destroy the world many times over. Another side to the initiatives of the 1980s, I think we saw particularly in Ireland in the aftermath of the Chernobyl tragedy. Not a military tragedy, a civil nuclear power tragedy, but in the movement, again, a renewed awareness of the horrific impacts of nuclear radiation, of the power of a nuclear explosion, and of the environmental and human health impacts of a nuclear explosion. And Eddie Roach, who the founder of the Chernobyl Children International, was actively involved in the anti-nuclear campaigning in Ireland at that time, and brought her awareness of nuclear issues to a new humanitarian dimension in seeking to relieve the suffering of the victims of Chernobyl, the work which continues today in the Chernobyl Children International. But as we continue from there into the 21st century, there was an increasing sense that the Non-Proliferation Treaty was stuck, and perhaps increasing the longer it stayed deadlocked in terms of any progress towards disarmament, it became less fit for purpose in terms of realising its key aims. And that gave the momentum to a new movement, or a new strand of movement in the 2010s in particular, also inspired by the movement to ban landmines and to ban cluster munitions, and the success of the conventions against cluster munitions and landmines. And one of the, I suppose, proud moments of Irish foreign policy was when the cluster munitions convention was agreed in Dublin in, I think, 2008. And the new momentum there drew not on the previous traditions of arms limitations and balances between military blocs, but recovered the voices of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also those affected deeply by nuclear testing in various parts of the world, in Kazakhstan, in Australia, in the Pacific Islands, in New Mexico, and very often the indigenous peoples subjugated by Western colonial powers, whose voices have been silenced by the impact of nuclear weapons, the destruction of their homelands, their territories, their sacred environments. And recovering those voices gave a new momentum, and engaging once again with that memory of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons gave a renewed momentum to the stale diplomatic balancing that the Non-Proliferation Treaty had been bogged down in. And Ireland was one of 6 countries alongside Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Austria and Nigeria, which put forward a new resolution in 2016 for negotiations on a new treaty to formally outlaw nuclear weapons, which the Non-Proliferation Treaty had not done, only to work towards that goal of disarmament. And after negotiating sessions in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was passed by 120 member states of the United Nations. It has since been ratified or signed by 99 states. So more than half of the member states of the United Nations, including 5 of the most populated states in the United Nations. And we often have the focus on the countries like China and the United States, and India, which are heavily populated countries with nuclear weapons. But among the 10 most heavily populated countries, 5 of those, including Brazil, Nigeria, India's neighbour Bangladesh, are also signed up to the outlawing and banning of nuclear weapons. So that is an important part of that momentum as well, that it is not just the small states like Ireland, but also the emerging states of perhaps what will be a new world order in the coming decades. Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, and others, who are taking a leading role in working towards disarmament today, and in working towards the stigmatization and outlawing of nuclear weapons. So for more than half the world's states, nuclear weapons are outlawed, with knock-on effects. One of the important, powerful effects, I think, was that after Ireland ratified the treaty, Irish state funds were divested from all companies involved in the nuclear weapons industry. And that's one of the powerful lines of attack against nuclear weapons and against militarisation, the financial aspect of it. Since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force, the number of financial companies and financial services companies invested in nuclear weapons companies has fallen by a quarter. That's quite a significant fall in less than 5 years. So there is momentum there. We often don't hear the good news or that sense of momentum in the headlines, but it is happening, and it's happening in a world of dramatic change which I think of a pace and of a nature which many of us did not envisage happening. But alongside the bad news in the headlines, I think there are grounds for hope, and there are grounds for determination to continue our recollection, to continue our interaction with the memory of the experiences of people like Kyoko and so many others who have shared their testimony and carried in their lives the impact of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, and to continue that work at a diplomatic level, at a campaigning level, at an academic level, of working towards a peaceful world free of that cataclysmic threat. And it's significant that more than half the world's states are now working towards that together. And earlier this year, at the third meeting of states parties, as well as the action plan for that, which contains important work on areas of including victim remediation and environmental remediation, and recognising the disproportionate impact on women and children of nuclear radiation caused both by civil installations and accidents and nuclear weapons. The final point in the declaration from that, I think, sums up that aspiration of the majority of the world. The complete, verifiable and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons is not just an aspiration, but an imperative for global security and the survival of humanity. We are confident that the effective implementation and universalisation of the treaty will ensure that nuclear weapons are never used, tested or threatened to be used again. The challenges before us can and will be overcome as we progress in bringing every state to join the treaty, dismantling every warhead, providing justice to all affected communities, and ending the era of nuclear weapons forever.
Kyoko, are there any final responses you'd like to say, or what is it you most hope that we take away from your story here tonight?
I said this afternoon to people, there are lots of people who think use of nuclear weapon on humanity is absolutely no things. But there are lots of people are in silent majority. They're thinking about it, how bad using nuclear weapon on humanity, talking about it, but it's not doing anything about it. And I do like to see people to take action. Another word is like signing to petition, ICANN or CND or any organization, to voice your feeling towards this issue. So what I want to say, do something. Please not stay in a silent majority. If you think we won't eliminate this evil weapon from this world, we have to do something about it. So, political way or personal way, signing to petition. Anyway, do something. That's what I really wish from people. Because Until 2003, I knew I have to talk about my experience and tell how horrendous this nuclear weapon, dropped on the nuclear weapons, how affect human life. But I didn't have guts to do that because it's too much, too painful to me to talk about this. And even now, I don't really want to talk about it. But I'm 77 now, and while I can walk and talk, I do like to tell people how evil this weapon is. So I'm doing it, and I hope other people do. Not just thinking about, talking about, but to do something to eliminate this evil weapon from our world.
At Afri Action from Ireland, our work really connects with our own history in Ireland, connecting to An Gaoirse Mór, our own experience of colonisation and forced migration. And we believe that remembering the past is not just for remembrance sake. We do this from Hiroshima to our own histories of dispossession because we know that it empowers us to imagine and build a more peaceful future. And I feel like that's part of it here tonight. So let us really carry that spirit forward together and say no more Hiroshimas, no more Nagasakis. And to borrow the words of Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow, each person had a name, each person was loved by someone. Let us ensure that their deaths were not in vain and that it happens never again. So thank you all so much for being here and being part of this remembrance and solidarity. And we hope to see you at an event soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.